All right, let's get started. Welcome to Bite Size Data Fundamentals Data Governance 101, where we talk about big topics in a bite-sized format. We are so excited for you to be here today to talk with Hannah from CDT about data governance. Our agenda today is I'm going to introduce and welcome everybody. I'm going to pass things over to Hannah to talk about data governance, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. As we are going through the presentation, please put your questions in the chat. We will be able to address some in the presentation itself, but we will address all of your questions at the end of the session. So please populate that chat with any questions and comments you might have, and we will be excited to talk about them with you during the webinar. I'm Jonathan Barry Wolf, Marketing Communications member of the Project Unicorn team, and I'm here with Hannah Quaid-Olavallee from CDT. She's a senior technologist and we'll be talking about data governance with all of us today. But before we get started with data governance, I want to talk a little bit about Project Unicorn. We are an organization dedicated to advancing and implementing data interoperability in K-12 ed tech tools. If you are a school district tech leader or an ed tech vendor, please sign the Project Unicorn Pledge. Signing the pledge is an outward expression of your dedication to data interoperability implementation, and it also allows you to receive specialized support from us, technical assistance, and to be one of the first people to find out about webinars like this one and other resources from us and our partners. It's free to sign the pledge, and we really are encouraging all of you to do so today. The links to this and everything I will be talking about will be in the chat. So be sure to sign the Project Unicorn Pledge. Additionally, if you're an EdTech vendor here today, apply for the Project Unicorn Interoperability Certification. The certification is offered in partnership with our friends at Digital Promise. And essentially, you will complete the certification and the interoperability of your EdTech tool will be ranked from Tier 1 to Tier 4. You'll receive a cool little badge like the one you see on this slide, which you can display on your website and anywhere else. And in addition to the cool badge, you will also receive some technical assistance from Project Unicorn to help you to improve that score. So again, the link is in the chat for the certification. We encourage you to complete it. Also, the Project Unicorn School System Data Survey is in its second annual year. Last year's survey went out to K-12 schools nationwide and took the pulse of data interoperability across the United States. Essentially, through the domains that we researched through the survey, we were able to find out the areas in which K-12 school district tech folks are doing really well, and then areas that, of course, need some growth and improvement. And the survey results directly impacted this webinar and a lot of the other offerings from us and our partners. We're in the second year of the survey, so please complete the survey. The link is in the chat. And every person who completes the survey receives a $25 Amazon gift card. So really can't go wrong there. Complete the survey, link in the chat. Also, if you enjoy this webinar and other webinars from us, as well as our resources and the resources of our partners, sign up for the Project Unicorn newsletter. We are always sending out promo for these types of events and more. Go to our website, projectunicorn.org. And then scroll to the bottom, you'll see this little block on your screen, input your email address, and you will start receiving updates from us. And finally, I just want to communicate Project Unicorn's definition of data interoperability. Data interoperability is the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. And now that we are all on the same footing here, I'm going to pass things over to Hannah. Hannah.
Thanks, Jonathan. I will go ahead and share my slides, hopefully y'all can see. Awesome. So as Jonathan mentioned, this presentation is going to be a little bit of a data governance 101, kind of an overview. And so to that end, I'll just go ahead and lay out the goals for the session. But first, I want to reiterate Jonathan's call that please feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we're talking. I will try to leave time for questions at the end, but I have been known to get a little verbose. So ask your questions when you have them and we will get to them as they come up. So as far as the goals for this session, first of all, just getting a sense of what responsible and ethical data use is and why it's something that we care about in the education context. And then just talking a little bit about how data governance programs can support that responsible use and further some of the ethical principles that we care about in the process of educating kids. And some of this intro session maybe is a little going to look very familiar to all of you, but I'm very much of the approach of like bring everyone along. So I'm going to just go a little bit over some of the benefits and harms of data and technology programs as they exist in schools. So of course, there's a huge opportunities to be had when it comes to data and technology programs. I mean, the biggest ones are probably providing insight into outcomes to really make sure that we're improving education and educational outcomes over time. As part of that, creating more efficient systems and freeing up resources for other uses, particularly trying to get those resources into classrooms and with kids. And then of course, one that I should have put on this slide and forgot, but just that like, as we live in sort of an increasingly technical world, making sure that that's part of children's education too, just to make sure that they're set up for the world that they're moving into. But of course, I think it's no surprise to anybody on this call that there are, of course, pretty significant risks that come along with data and technology programs as well. Of course, the big ones, obviously, data breaches can really put students and family in harm's way, both financially and just sort of privacy and personal agency-wise. Using data in ways that the community wouldn't expect or didn't quite understand can really damage that trust between the community and the school, which makes education harder. It makes it harder to implement solid programs in the future if your community is kind of on the back foot and worried about what's going to happen if they hand over, their data. And then of course, there's just, making sure that if we're collecting this data, if we have all this data and technology, how do we make sure we're really making good use of it, pulling the insights we want out of it? So managing data well, understanding what we have and how to use it is also really important as far as making sure that we reap the benefits of that data. So to that end, data governance and what we have called data ethics, although you may have heard the term responsible data use, ethical data use, beneficial data use, these are all kind of terms that feed into this overall like what are our kind of foundational principles as we're using data and technology. So robust data governance programs are really a method to ensure that this responsible use principles are upheld. So it's the management of data technology, including people and the processes and the structures that all oversee how the data and technology is ultimately used. And then that is all in support of data ethics, which is this set of principles about how we manage and share and collect data in a way that is really limiting or avoiding harms to individuals and still serves this overall public good that we're all in the business of trying to serve in the education context. So for this slide, I'm just going to go over a couple of just an overview of a few kinds of things that tend to be part of data governance programs. This is by no means exhaustive. Data governance programs can and probably should be very expansive, covering a really broad range of issues. But I'm going to go over just 3 contexts where data governance can really help support ethical principles, just as kind of an oversight and as examples of how these governance programs can be used in support of responsible and trustworthy use of data. So the 3 that we'll talk about will be data inventories and retention schedules, use limitations and access management on data, and then community engagement processes when it comes to data and technology. So we'll start off just looking at a best practice of data inventories and retention schedules. So in order to protect student privacy, it's really critical that schools understand both what data they have in order to make sure that they're using that data effectively and protecting it effectively. And then also, since data does represent risk, right? Any data that you do have is potential for a data breach, it's potential for mismanagement or unnecessary access. It's it's generally a great principle to only have data that you actually need and that you're actually benefiting from. So getting rid of unnecessary data is also pretty critical to protecting students' privacy and community trust. So there's a couple data governance steps that schools can take to help ensure that these ethical principles of privacy and expected data use are upheld. So the first one that we mentioned is inventorying systems and data, right? So setting up an inventory allows you to get a sense of what all data you have in your school, right? What programs are being used, what kinds of data are they collecting, what kind of data are being collected through surveys or through start of year forms. And so these inventory processes need to be pretty expansive. And this all allows you to know what's in the system. And the reason that's important, as I mentioned, is sort of twofold. The first one is this kind of idea of like, well, you should make sure that you're making use of what you have, right? So if you have, pretty extensive information about student outcomes over time, given a particular curriculum, if you're just sitting on that, that doesn't help you very much. So if you know you have it, you can start looking at these outcomes over time. Do changes in the curriculum improve outcomes, or if it turns out they're not helpful and it's actually not benefiting students, and it's better to go back to the old way. So knowing what data you have allows you to make maximal use of it. The other reason to do that is to make sure that it's adequately protected, right? So it may be the case that you are collecting family information about students at the beginning of year through forms, and that is maybe happening through the school IT system, so you know what's happening, and that can be pretty sensitive information. So you're keeping it, you have a pretty good access control system over it, you are making sure that it's secured, that it's encrypted. Now, it's entirely possible that there's also who's using a system that collects similar information, maybe for social emotional or to try to get this better. But because not going through the main IT system, maybe the security staff and the technical staff don't know that that's happening. So that system, which is collecting really similar data, that data is not being secured in the same way. It's maybe a little bit less well protected. Sorry, I'm turning video off because I got a little notification that my internet might be unstable. So please let me know if you're having trouble hearing me. So in that inventorying data, working with TC, what all is there, allows you to make sure that that data, which is similarly sensitive, is protected in the same kinds of ways. Additionally, you can probably get resources by just, if the teacher is going ahead and collecting that and you already have it, maybe you can just plug them into what you already have and you don't need to be storing the same data twice, the same or similar data twice. The next step after inventorying data and knowing what all you have is making sure that you're only keeping that data around for as long as it's useful. And this again goes back to storing data that you're not making good use of or that isn't useful to you anymore, just presents unnecessary risk without much benefit. So building retention schedules allows you to delete data once you no longer use it, make sure it's deleted with an effective methodology, and that goes ahead and clears some risks off your books, which then can help ensure student privacy is protected because you're limiting the potential for breaches or unnecessary access. So that's one example of how data governance can really help underpin some ethical principles here. The next one that we'll talk about is use limitations and access management. And again, the ethical principles here are going to look kind of familiar to deletion and retention schedules, which really a big one about there is about privacy, right? So ensuring that the sensitive student data that you have is protected. It's only accessed by people who need it, because that's pretty critical to students' privacy, both as a general principle and to ensure, that everybody who has access to sensitive data is trained on it, understands why it's sensitive and how it could impact students. So if you know who has access to sensitive data, you can sort of help ensure that those principles are upheld. The other reason that use limitations and access management can be really important, another fundamental ethical principle here, is ensuring community trust, right? So communities, when they hand over data or realize the data is being collected, or even if it's being collected, they don't necessarily aware that that's happening, right? Maybe they're not aware that attendance records are maintained and stored for long periods of time. But probably they have some sense of expectation about what the school is going to do with their data, that data is predominantly going to be used to further their students' education or overall improvement of the school. So that ethical principle, ensuring that the community's expectations are met and that their trust stays sound, is pretty important to ensuring that you're able to continue to working with the community going forward. So there's a couple ways that data governance can help underpin these ethical principles of privacy and of community trust. So as far as community trust and ensuring that data is used as expected, part of that is having a process at the beginning of data collection and probably during a data inventory process of what the intended use is for a specific piece of data. And the reason that this can help is if parents and families and students have one expectation at the moment that the data is collected, you want to ensure that that expectation is maintained over time, right? It's really easy if you don't have documentation of this sort of thing to say like, oh, well, we actually have this whole data set that would be really interesting and helpful for this new project that we have. Let's just go ahead and pull it over. And that might make sense, but if the community doesn't expect that and then they find out about it after the fact, that can damage that trust. So having documentation about like when this data was collected, this was the expected use for it, this is what we communicated that it would be used for, and we need to make sure that we carry that through. Now, once you do that, that also tees you up, if needed, to go back to your community and say, hey, we have this data, we plan to use it for this purpose, but now we think that there's this other benefit. And that allows you to have that conversation at the outset before any trust damage. So yeah, having those uses documented and clarified early on in the process helps to make sure that those boundaries don't kind of slip without anyone noticing, especially if new team or new settings, that they are given that context for what that data was used for and kind of what the community expectations around that will be. Another important part of that privacy component is ensuring that data is only accessed by people who are authorized to do so. Now, as I mentioned, this is important both just as a general privacy principle, right? Like if data is sensitive or feels personal, students and families aren't going to want that to just be accessed just because, right? They kind of have an expectation that it's only going to be accessed when it's needed, when there's a use for it. And so having that that's also sort of tied into this intended use also gives you the framework to figure out, okay, well, now that we know what this data is used for, who then needs access to it? That also helps you make sure that staff is appropriately trained on how to manage particular kinds of data, right? So if you know that certain staff are going to end up needing access to, for instance, family data about students in foster care, right? You can make sure that they understand the emotional impact of that information on students and ensure that the way that they talk about it meets students' expectation, protects students' privacy along that front. If people are accessing data that they don't necessarily need, they may also not have that training, and that opens up the door for insensitive uses or a teacher who maybe isn't aware that being in foster care can feel really private, so they mention it in front of the class without thinking about how that student is going to be impacted by that. So having these access management roles also really allows you to ensure that the training is there, that the foundation is there to protect students and families. Of course, there's good technical ways to do that, right? Once you have the kind of list in your mind of who all needs access to that, there's technical systems you can set up to help ensure that that happens efficiently and reduce human error on that front. But that's sort of after the initial step of figuring out, okay, who needs to access this data and why. Now, as I mentioned, both of these sort of feed into another best practice, another best data governance practice, which is community engagement. A couple of the principles that underlie the need for community engagement, really the big one is this trust between schools and their communities. So that's particularly important with data and technology programs because it's an area where there can sometimes be a knowledge gap between the school and the community. So ensuring that the trust is met ensuring that the trust is met requires making sure that the communities, families, and students are sort of brought along on that journey, that they understand how their data is going to be used, what new technology programs are doing. That understanding is really a really important first step to basically consent, right? You can't really consent to things if you don't understand exactly what's going to happen or how it's going to happen. So the data governance practice that can really feed into this trust is this community engagement, right? So making sure that the communities have a chance to explain their needs and their perceptions of the issue both can raise issues early on in the data and technology collection process, which allows you to address them before they become issues. It can also just help clear up points of misunderstanding, right? If a community is concerned about a particular use, but that's not actually something that you're planning to do, then that community engagement process is an opportunity to explain that and really reinforce that trust of like, yes, we hear you, and that's not, that particular use that you're concerned about is not on the table. And then, of course, the other part of that is really making sure communities have a chance to offer their feedback, to weigh in early on in the process before things get too far down the path and they're hard to change, making sure communities can really engage on those processes, explain where they're coming from, offer feedback that would make programs more effective or less concerning to communities, right? And that could be even just letting you know, like, hey, some percentage of your community doesn't speak English, so having this program, having documentation about this program available in whatever other language, like that's really useful feedback that's going to help reinforce that trust. So those are 3 examples just of how you can have these principles and responsible data use goals from the beginning, and how data governance systems and processes can help really reinforce that. Since that was kind of a quick overview, CDT does have a number, CDT and some other organizations have a number of resources about these issues that can help dig into this all. A broader, we only did a really, I'll go ahead and drop links in the chat. In the meantime, I'm just gonna go ahead and put it up to questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Hannah. And please, we have a couple minutes left, so put some questions in the chat for Hannah, and we will get started in talking about them. Hannah, I wanted to ask, so like I said at the beginning, the State of the Sector report that we completed this past year identified data governance as being sort of the #1 biggest challenge. And so I kind of wanted to hear from you about what would you say is sort of what's the biggest thing that makes it so challenging? And you have a piece of advice that would be helpful for folks in addressing that kind of a challenge.
Yeah. I think one of the things so challenging, which I kind of hinted at in the fact that this is very much an overview presentation, is its governance programs tend to be incredibly expansive, or, data governance, like as data and technology programs were growing anyway, and then the pandemic happened and they sort of exploded. And a lot of that happened really rapidly. Data governance, I think, to some degree sort of fell to the wayside because it was not as urgent as like getting kids back into some form of learning. And so data governance, it's hard because it's a huge issue. It's also more challenging to do when you're trying to do it a little bit retroactively, which is the situation a lot of schools have now ended up in, just by virtue of, again, as I said, the pandemic kind of threw us all for quite a loop. So I think the kind of advice I would have, to the extent this is sort of cop out as far as advice because it's kind of basic, but breaking it into smaller programs. And one of the things my team pointed out to me when they were reviewing these slides was I originally had data governance program in the singular. And my teammates pointed out, like, that really needs to be plural, because trying to approach this as a single job is going to just be an overwhelming mess, basically. So trying to break it down, and however, different schools are going to break it down differently depending on what makes sense for them. But whether that means, first we're going to deal with all of the admin data that we have, and then we're going to go ahead and start dealing with classroom technology data, and then we're going to go ahead and start dealing with, vendor data, like whatever it is, however you break it down. Maybe it makes more sense to break it down by grade or by data type or by, where the data is coming in, but having these kind of trying to bite it off into smaller chunks. And I think that that's one of the reasons the data inventory was one of the examples just used. That's like that as a first data inventory can really help you get a sense of like, okay, now what, right? Like where from? And the one of the resource I dropped in data deletion and retention report has an appendix a little bit about how to go about doing data inventory. That can be kind of a good place to start. There's also a question in the chat about Rachel. I'm curious how taking feedback from families regarding data use was conducted. That really varies also based on the school community, which is another challenging thing. We have, again, in the resource 2-pager about conducting community engagement because it is so critical. I think the way, the sort of how it's conducted, one of the things that we talk about in that 2-pager is that it really is helpful to do it through a fair number of different channels, right? Whether that's, you know, having in-person town hall meetings, sending out email surveys, even doing phone calls, sending home paper questionnaires, just to, depending on the breadth of the community, like having different forms of access. You know, it's also community engagement. You want it to be a pretty robust process, but that doesn't mean it needs to be like one big meeting hammer everything out. Another approach is just very regular engagement, right? Whether that's sending, you know, once or twice a month, just about like, hey, here's what's going on. This is this new technology we're using. This is how it's working. And another piece of feedback we've gotten, CDT has done a large scale surveys and studies of parents and students. And one of the things parents talk about is having something that they can kind of go back and reference over time. So long-term materials, whether that's a handout or a PDF that's emailed instead of just like a one-time form that you sign and then it kind of disappears into the ether, having something they can go back and reference was something that parents talked about is really helpful as far as that engagement process goes. As I say, as a person who's really guilty of signing forms and then forgetting, you know, what was in them or where I put them or how they came into me in the first place. So the parent who noted that, I was like, oh yeah, that's a good point.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you all for being here today. We are so excited you had the opportunity to join us for this event. I want to quickly plug Project Unicorn events page. Just go to our website /events for all the details about our upcoming webinars and conference appearances and more. It's a great spot to go to find out more about the Bite-Sized Data Fundamentals series and everything we've got going on events-wise. Please check that out. If you have any questions, please email us, projectunicorn@innovateedunyc.org. Also, Hannah's email is hannah@cdt.org. I think she'll put that in the chat for you all. If you have any questions, we'll be following up with this recording as well as the slides with all the links that were sent out in the chat and talked about. So be sure to be on the lookout for that. And thank you all so much for being here, and we will see you at the next one. Thanks so much.